All right. Welcome, folks, for yet another episode of Hangar DX. Today, with us, we have Ben Pullen joining us from Faire. And Faire has seen a lot of interesting growth. And today, they're managing one of our big monorepos. Would love to dive into that topic and learn more about like how teams manage monorepos. So, Ben, I'm really excited for this conversation. Monorepos are definitely a topic which comes up very on and off, and I know it's very opinionated as well. So, this will be a great conversation. So, let's start with a brief introduction of yourself, and we will dive straight into the core topic after that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. My name's Ben Poland. I'm a staff platform engineer here at Faire. For those who don't know about Faire, we're an online wholesale marketplace that helps independent retailers find products to stock in their stores by connecting them with the brands that make those products. So I live in Waterloo, Canada. I've been at Faire for almost 5 years. I started my career at BlackBerry, also in town here. Had a few stops in between there, but I've always really gravitated towards DevOps, virtual infrastructure, and developer productivity stuff.
Amazing. And share a little bit about like how does Fair think about developer experience? Is there like a formal function? Does it come under like platform engineering? Is it like part of like DevOps? Share a bit more.
Yeah, so I'm actually a tech lead on our platform productivity team, who are responsible for developer experience, developer productivity at Faire. We have a dedicated team under platform. It's a big area of focus. As a tech company, keeping our developers happy and productive is super important. You want people to be happy, and people stick around when they're happy, right? So it's really around like unblocking them and letting them do their work, right? Three big pieces we think about: local development through to opening a pull request, CI, code review, that kind of thing, through to deployment. But I think some other things we don't think about as often are, before we even start coding, what do those interactions with product or design look like? How do we gather the requirements and plan out a solution? And how do we get feedback from other stakeholders? And then also, like, after the code gets shipped, how do we make sure that developers can make sure things are working like they intended them to work? How do we think about observability and finding and fixing any issues that are out there?
Very cool. Actually, I may go on that tangent and ask a little bit more, but like before we get there, maybe share a bit about like the current scale. Like how many developers are there roughly? Kind of like how
Yeah.
many are supporting?
So we have, I don't have exact numbers. I think we're somewhere
Sure.
north of 300 engineers.
Okay.
A big chunk of that is backend, a sizable chunk of front end, and then some iOS and Android as well. And I was just looking today. We have about 2,000 commits running through CI every day.
Wow.
And about 30,000 builds per day on those commits. And one other thing I wanted to just mention: we use Kubernetes pretty heavily for our CI. I know that's somewhat uncommon. I don't know, but we've really leaned into Kubernetes.
That's very cool. And do most of the folks work on the monorepos?
Yeah, so in terms of monorepos, we have a backend monorepo, front end monorepo that's in the process of becoming a monorepo. We've previously had more of a multi repo setup for our front end, but some folks are in the process of combining that all into one front end monorepo. And then on the Android and iOS sides, those are separate repos as well. So kind of we're moving towards four big repos, not a Google style monorepo, but still it's kind of grouped around code bases and languages.
That's very cool. So, especially you said that front end sort of like started with multiple repos, moving towards monorepo.
Yeah.
What's the rationale behind it? Like, how are you folks thinking about like using monorepos versus having separate repositories?
Yeah, I will start this out by saying the front end monorepo migration is not something I've been super involved with, but my understanding is that it's the same reason why anyone would move to a monorepo. Wanting to have more standardization, common code, that you don't want to be bumping dependencies across 30, 40, hundreds of repos, right? When you make a change to a common library. And then also, allowing people to make changes to a bigger part of the code base all at once, rather than needing to make similar changes in, dozens, hundreds, however many repos, right?
Interesting. So, for the audience, I would love to have your take on, especially you've seen kind of like in some ways both sides of the world. Are there certain things in Monorepo that people either take for granted, or it's like, maybe it's like really hard that you move to Monorepo and things become suddenly very hard. Do you have like any examples of thoughts of that?
Yeah. So, when I started at Faire, the backend that I work a little more closely with was already a monorepo, although there are only, I think, two or three services in it. But the groundwork was laid for for a monorepo, right? But I think, building and testing your services in the same way is a big benefit of a monorepo, right? As we've scaled out to dozens of services, having those common components, common and also shared code, right? Having that all together in one place is a big benefit. And so I feel like starting out with a monorepo is going to be obviously way easier than moving all sorts of different apps into a monorepo, because you're going to have to go through that standardization process. I'm not some sort of monorepo zealot that's going to sit here and say everything's better with a monorepo. It's really, for different companies, for different situations, I think either one might make sense. For us, we're used to it. We've kind of found the issues and done what we can to solve them. But it's not sunshine and rainbows every day. There's challenges with the monorepo too.
Okay. Do you want to just share any kind of like challenge, either it's sort of like something that you've solved or you're feel or like experiencing right now?
Yeah. So recently, we were running into an issue in CI where our Git checkouts were taking longer and longer. We use GitHub. And so we started thinking, okay, what's going on here? Is there something in our infrastructure on our side that's causing this? At the same time, reached out to GitHub to see, is there anything on their side that they can see? Um, GitHub support can be a little hit and miss sometimes. It took them a little while to get back to us, but um, it, in the meantime, we're like, okay, what can we do to mitigate this issue? So it really was just, the Git command line was taking forever to pull down the blobs, to pull things down. So we eventually did hear back from GitHub that they were throttling us, which, I feel like if you're gonna rate limit, send me a 429 and say, hey, this is too many requests. But instead, they were like just slowing us down until we noticed, which I wasn't thrilled about. But at least we knew what the root cause was, right? And so we narrowed it down. I think we're going to go into it in a bit, but we've been splitting out our monorepo CI from a huge giant pipeline into multiple smaller pipelines. And as you can imagine, as part of that, we're checking out the repo more than we used to be. Um, we'd already, so I mentioned we're in Kubernetes. We already had a Git caching layer inside of Kubernetes. Each Kubernetes node keeps a copy of the Git repo, but just I guess the number of checkouts was increasing, and we were spreading across more Kubernetes nodes, and GitHub started rate limiting us. So the first immediate mitigation was, okay, what can we do? Let's cordon the Kubernetes nodes that are hitting this issue. So the one job that's cloning the repo is slowed down, but at least we're not loading a bunch more jobs onto that node and slowing them down as well. So we were able to put that in relatively quickly. We talked a little bit more about it and ended up, when our Kubernetes nodes start up, we download a copy of the repo that's just like stored in S3 as a tarball. Just download it and extract it. And kind of start our Git cache with a copy of the repo that's 95, 99% there, right? It might be a day out of date. We populate that daily, so it could be up to a day out of date, but at least the vast majority of the commits are already going to be there. And then when what we're actually getting from GitHub is just that last little 1%. And so we're finding that's working pretty well.
That's interesting. Like, I mean, sounds like you're sort of like setting up a mirror, almost mirror esque.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. And like I say, we were already trying to do that, having a separate mirror on each Kubernetes node so that subsequent jobs on that node would be able to reuse it. But it was just, we were hitting it, 10 a.m., 9:30, 10 a.m. as, everybody's pushing their code. Our CI cluster is scaling up and all of the nodes were trying to pull down the repo at the same time. We were hitting this day after day. So,
Very cool.
yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to learn kind of like how people solve these kind of problems. I would want to at least like dive a bit more into Kubernetes. Share a bit about like,
Sure.
why Kubernetes for CI and like how is it holding up?
Yeah. So, I think like the main reason is just, if you can containerize your CI, if you can keep it clean, hopefully you're going to avoid some of those, oh, my build farm has, one node has this file on it that causes my build to fail. And I'm not going to say still doesn't happen in Kubernetes sometimes, but in general, we have this repeatable environment that we're building the same way from starting from the same empty state and going. And so that's basically the benefit of Kubernetes, I think, as well as leveraging some of the tooling and some of the expertise. So we run our real environments in Kubernetes as well, so we can reuse some of that tooling, some of those processes to build out our internal clusters as well. And we have like observability and other stuff set up already to to work with Kubernetes. Um, so I think since I started, we've been more on the Kubernetes side, and like I say, that nothing's perfect. You're always going to run into some challenges, but um, I guess the other side of it is like scalability. So you know, if you have a fixed set of build servers, um, you're only going to be able to throw so much at them before you have to scale them horizontally. So with Kubernetes, we have some of the tooling like cluster autoscaler and other stuff so that we can dynamically scale up and down our cluster. Like overnight, we're down to zero instances running, and then during the day we can scale up. So Kubernetes handles that relatively well. Um, so,
Interesting. So, if you're using that in your CI system, is that used both for build and test?
yeah. So yeah, build, test, linting, basically everything. The only place we can't do it is with our iOS builds because they need Macs, right? Um, but Android, back end, front end, we use Kubernetes across the
Very
board.
cool. And does it help with any kind of like distribution, like kind of like running parallel tests, parallel builds as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you can basically go as wide as you want to. Like cluster autoscaler takes a little while to scale things up, but yeah, you're worried less about how many individual tasks or I don't know. I mean, like I've been doing this for 5 years now with Kubernetes, so I kind of forget how it was before then. But yeah, like you don't worry about how many parallel jobs or stuff you're running.
Interesting. So coming back to monorepos, you talked about like you're running kind of like giant monorepos. Sure, there's like four of them, but still, I'm guessing many of the changes would require running a lot of like builds and CI. Do you have any kind of like best practices? Do you use any kind of like these modern build tools to scale up your uh, remote caching of builds or test,
Yep.
for instance? Yeah, what's kind of like been your strategy so far?
Yeah, so I'll focus on our backend repo. It's a Kotlin monorepo. So we're using Gradle as our build tool right now. Um, I think we're kind of looking at Bazel maybe a little bit, but great Gradle works well. It does have some challenges with larger repos with a lot of projects. We have over 1,000 Gradle projects in the repo. we struggle with configuration time and some other stuff. It does feel like the Gradle team is working on that. Gradle 9 and there's stuff on the horizon that may help. Configuration caching has been a big improvement locally, less so in CI because it's not very reusable there yet. I assume they're working on that. I think the Gradle remote build cache is huge. I don't think we could run CI without it. In terms of just avoidance of not rebuilding the entire world when we don't need to. We rely very heavily on Gradle task avoidance and making sure that we're keeping our dependency tree clean, so that we can reduce if somebody's making a code change in one small area, that doesn't spider out and cause a rebuild of the entire repo, right? We also rely on parallel test execution. Gradle Enterprise Devlocity has a remote test execution that we are not using because we ran into some issues getting that working. So we've actually built out a custom parallel test execution setup. And then I think the other big thing that we're in the process of moving to is multiple pipelines in our repo. So I touched on it earlier. We have this massive Jenkins build that does a whole bunch of stuff all together, and it's kind of all or nothing. If one tiny little bit fails, then everything dies, right? Everything fails, you have to rerun it all. And so as we've been breaking out to multiple pipelines, we're calling it poly CI. Um, Having a small focused pipeline just for one service in the repo has been a really, really great experience for our developers. Like I say, we're not quite there yet. We still have Jenkins as a required check, but what the end of the end is in sight, right? And I think people can see that light at the end of the tunnel, that things are going to be better once we can get rid of that massive pipeline.
That's interesting. So sounds like you're trying to tackle this problem at multiple levels, right? Like, I mean, Bazel or like Gradle, for instance, also does remote caching. I'm guessing like it also does some sort of like test selection, as in, or like caching in the sense, like if certain things are not modified, it won't run the test for it.
Yeah, so with Gradle, everything is at a task
Hmm.
granularity. So if you have your so and each task is per project. So I mentioned we have 1,000 plus Gradle projects in our monorepo. 1,000 projects with tests, and so if you change the tests in one of the projects, only those tests will run. The other 999 plus projects won't run their tests, right? Gradle does that by default. Um, but we also do have some custom test avoidance on layered on top of that. So we have this monorepo with multi services, microservices. We call them multi-services, but we also have a monolith in this repo. So there are some tests in the monolith that are quite heavy, and the as the oldest part of our code, some of the dependencies are not as clean as they should be, and so we have some custom avoidance to say, hey, don't run these really heavy tests unless you've actually changed something in that project. If you've changed some child dependency of it, let's skip those in the PR build. But we still run them in main. But let's try to cut down on some of that. So we have some like handcrafted avoidance rules in place for stuff like that. But as I mentioned, we rely heavily on Gradle and their task avoidance, right?
So I have a question then. Why do you still need a poly pipeline if kind of like Gradle is already doing sort of like that selection in some ways based on the code changes
Yep.
that you're having? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
technically that should also help you reduce the pipeline load.
Yep. It does. The downside is like if you have all of these checks in one spot, I think I mentioned this, one tiny little thing flakes out or fails, the whole build is dead and you have to rerun the whole thing. And sure, maybe that second build will hit the Gradle cache on a bunch of the stuff, but it still takes time. And, I guess another big thing about the massive pipeline is it's hard sometimes for folks to tell when it fails, what actually happened here because there's so much going on, right? If you have a smaller, more focused pipeline that's just for this one service, first of all, you see in GitHub, you say, oh, our search service pipeline failed. I know where the problem is. I click in there. It's very focused, and I can see, I have some idea of where the problem lies rather than, oh, let's go look at Jenkins and try to figure out.
So I also know, like, in GitHub, there isn't really a very smart way to configure multiple pipelines in the sense, like, everything is either required or not required.
Yep.
Right? Like, how do you handle that for with
Sure.
Monorepo?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we struggled with this a little bit during our proof of concept, trying to figure out whether to make each of these pipelines required or what to do. As we're moving to Poly Pipeline, we're also moving from Jenkins to BuildKite. BuildKite has this feature trigger pipelines where so we kick off one pipeline that runs Gradle, figures out what's affected by this PR, and then triggers the pipelines, the child, all the child pipelines that are affected. And then it actually aggregates the status of all of those children back into one status check. And so that's been super helpful.
So it sounds
Yeah.
like a Bill Kite is sort of like doing some of the heavy lifting around identifying the checks.
Yeah. Yeah. If if one of those children fails, that bubbles up to the parent, and that reports a failure. And then if you retry that child, you can actually change it to a success. It'll report back the success. So
Very cool.
it's worked out really well for us. Yeah.
That's amazing. I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about dependency graphs. That's
Sure.
probably like the biggest pain typically people complain about,
Yep.
especially when they use monorepos. Managing clear, fine-grained dependencies can be hard, but that's
Hmm.
also a big core of like using systems like Bazel or Gradle to have like good distribution of caching.
Hmm.
Do you have like any suggestions, best practices? How would you even kind of like think about health of monorepo based on dependency graphs? Are there any best practices for having good dependency graphs?
Definitely, if you're not on top of it, things can snowball and you can get into real trouble. So we've actually written a custom Gradle plugin that we use to kind of enforce some requirements. So we have naming for our Gradle projects to kind of help identify whether they're an API, a client, like different pieces of code. And so based on that standard naming, we can kind of say, oh, this service can't depend on some other implementation of code in some other service. The Gradle plugin will block you, CI will block you. And so we kind of we use that to really enforce separation between our services. Within the service, we're a little bit less opinionated. We probably could be better about reducing the spaghetti-ness inside the service, but it's a little bit less important because our pipelines now are the granularity is basically the service, right? So we probably, once we finish this migration, I think we'll probably lean into that a little bit more. I think it's really important for us to be helping the developers do the right thing. I always talk about guide rails, not roadblocks, and trying to help people do the right thing, trying to point them in the right direction, but not block them. You're trying to get some code in, or you're trying to do something, and to get stopped at every avenue, it's really frustrating, right? So it's more about, yeah, helping them do the right thing, and then if you want to ignore me, okay, maybe better. um,
Kind of reminds me of this XKCD comic, I think, from a long time ago, which is like you start importing certain things until it compiles, and until the point you actually end up importing the entire world.
yeah, no, that when you're talking about that, we also use it's, I think, by Autonomous Apps. There's a Gradle dependency linting plugin, so that will help you identify unused dependencies, identify incorrect dependencies API versus implementation. We use that as well.
Very interesting. So I understand, like right now, you're going through a very large migration. kind of like to splitting up the your CI process itself.
Yeah.
How does maintenance looks like? I mean, what's kind of like next after you're done with this work? Like, do you expect there's going to be some ongoing maintenance, or do you think kind of like after that you can hopefully offload everything to developers to manage?
Yeah, I mean that last point I think is super important. We are a small team. Um, we can't do everything ourselves, and so I think that the best way that we can multiply our influence, our impact, is by building out the tools and the systems and the processes that the rest of the developers at Fair can leverage to building out those guardrails, right? To let them do the right thing on their own without us needing to be on top of them, following up with them all the time, right? And so it's about building out metrics, dashboards, and empowering them to see their own performance, see their own data, and decide for themselves if they want to change the numbers or not. At the end of the day, there are, like, we want to be consultants, we want to be guiding them, but not telling them how to do things and not enforcing things. And at the end of the day, like, if their dependency tree is a mess, and we can show them, hey, your build takes twice as long as everyone else. If you're okay with that, oh, okay, that's up to you, right? We're not going to say, hey, you have to get your build time down, because you're the ones feeling pain, right? So yeah, it's I think that's kind of, as we continue to grow, as we can continue to evolve, it's really, how can we empower our developers to have the data and have the um, have things in place so that they can kind of self-serve a lot of this stuff.
Very cool. Speaking of dashboards and metrics, what kind of like metrics or data is useful for like kind of things that you measure for CI?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. Like, getting good, useful metrics is complicated, and I think it would be great to see more more kind of off the shelf available stuff. We use Datadog pretty heavily. I was just reading CNCF. Just the Open Telemetry was talking about they're adding CI/CD support. So I'm excited to see where that goes. But in terms of what we're using right now, it's obviously build times. Like, that's something easy that we can measure ourselves, keep an eye on. But we also look at time to merge. So, from the time they open the PR, how long is it taking to get reviews? How long are those builds taking? How many builds does it take for a developer to get green? Because that might be an indication that we need to shift things a little bit farther left, and find ways to get them that feedback locally before they're even pushing their code. And then, once they have CI passing, how long does it take to merge? We use a merge queue, so that can affect the merge time as well. And then lead time, from the time they open the PR until they can get that deployed to production. We're working on measuring that a little bit better. On the deployment side, it's like, how frequent are deploys happening? Are we CDing that service or not? That side of things. And then I think I touched on, like, the local developer experience. It's a little harder because we don't have as much control over the tools, and so trying to extract meaningful data there, I think is a real challenge, because day to day developers are going to be doing different things locally.
For I mean, like going back to kind of like the whole topic around monorepos and splitting the CI, do you have any recommendations or like takeaways for any listeners who maybe just like started thinking about it as like, oh, like we have a monorepos, our CI times are going over the roof, like
Yep.
how should they think about breaking down their CI?
Got to look at the dependencies, right? Making sure that you've untangled those, making sure that those are in good shape. Because you need to have discrete chunks that you can break off the monorepo and build separately, right? And so for us, as we were looking at this, I think we were already in a decent spot in terms of dependency management and having those chunks that we could break off. But it was really about, okay, let's take a volunteer service and try running it separately, right? And see what that looks like, and take the time to get it right. You try to find that team or that service that will really work with you and give you feedback, data, and hearing from them about what they like, what they don't like, and use that as a starting point, right? And so we got it working really well for one service. And as you're building it out for one service, you're going to be scaling that out, right? So build it out in a way that the service name is not hard coded, it's a variable, or like whatever you can do just with that forethought, right? And so then, yeah, we're at the point now where we've scaled it out to all of our services. We still have our monolith and shared libraries and a bunch of other checks that are in Jenkins, but um, we're not done yet. I'm sure we'll hit other roadblocks, other issues as we go. But I think things have gone relatively smoothly for us so far.
That's amazing. I know, like, kind of like developer experience is something you can always, you always find a new goalpost once you solve a
Sure.
challenge. So yes, this is a
Yeah,
constant.
yeah. It's you're not doing your job until nobody knows you're there, right? Um, the goal is to not be noticed, for everyone to be able to be in the flow, do all their work, and not have any of the tooling or processes or anything block them, right?
Correct.
If nobody's asking questions, if nobody's that's a success, right?
All right, Ben. I think we have covered a lot of grounds on the CIs and like monorepos. So thank you so much for that. Let's go through the rapid fire questions if you're ready.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's
All right. So, what are the areas you're most excited about in DevX in the coming years?
Yeah, so I touched on it earlier, like the better observability. I think is there's a real gap in tooling in stuff out there. Like Datadog, we use. They've been working on it. They've been getting CI and CD observability in a better place, but there's still work to go. So the CNCF open telemetry stuff, I'm excited to see where that goes, but I think just having that as table stakes would be awesome. So
Amazing. What makes a good DX engineer?
yeah, I think someone who's a good problem solver. You need to be able to dig into some new area that you're not as familiar with and figure it out, and make sure that you're solving the end user's problem as quickly as possible. That sometimes means cutting some corners and coming back later, but how can you stop the bleeding? How can you get things working and then make them work. Some folks can really say, okay, how can we make this solution perfect? It's like people are suffering while you're trying to figure that out, right? So you need to be able to come up with something quickly.
Nice. What is your take on coding assistants?
I found them super useful personally for Terraform, for other like infrastructure as code stuff. I think they probably work a little better in a monorepo with more examples to look at. Maybe, I don't know, but obviously they can be super helpful. But you need to make sure you write good tests, because if somebody's just hitting tab, little weird things can slip in, right? If they're not paying close attention. But overall, I think it's a positive.
Amazing. And are there any specific use cases of LLM that you're excited about other than coding assistant?
Yeah, it's really around helping people help themselves, like I talked about earlier, like whether it's a question on Slack that somebody's asked before, and the bot can jump in right away and say, hey, try this, or a problem in CI, like with that monolithic Jenkins pipeline, we've built out LLM tools to look at the build and try to help the developer tell what happened, because sometimes it can be a challenge. So I think, yeah, finding ways to help people solve their own problems is the real exciting area for me.
Amazing. Do you have any favorite tools for DevX?
Yeah, I think I mentioned, BuildKite we've been super happy with, um, but I can give you some of the tools that I least like working with. One of them is Helm, for Kubernetes. I hate the fact that there's no diffs. I'm a huge Terraform person, and so one of the great things about Terraform is you plan, you see exactly what it's going to change, and you say that looks good, let's do that.
Apply.
With Helm, it's like, what's it going to do? I don't know. There is a diff that you can try to show it, but that diffs between what Helm applied last time and what Helm is about to apply this time, and you have no idea what might have changed in your Kubernetes cluster in between. And so everyone here knows if they get me started on Helm, I will I will talk their ear off. And then the other one is Jenkins. We've used it for quite a while here, but it just wasn't scaling, and the lack of high availability is probably and the so many updates, plugin updates all the time, and not being able to install those without taking downtime is it's just brutal for me and my team. Yeah.
Interesting. That's an interesting take. I've not heard on Helm, so good feedback. Are there any books? Are there any books that you recommend? Could be DevX related, could be otherwise.
Yeah, so I wish I had more time to read books. In general, for like work stuff, DevX stuff, it's I don't know. I find it hard to find books that are relevant. It's so I don't know if people have heard of good books. If you've heard of books, I would be interested. So,
I mean, that's really
yeah.
fine. Maybe we can cheat. We can say Hangar DX podcast is one of them.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome,
No,
Ben.
actually, yeah. Podcasts are great. Like to be able to listen to stuff is definitely easier than getting the time to sit down and read a book. So,
Sweet. All right, Ben. I think we went way over time, so this was a blast. Learned so much about like CI systems and all these like complications that happen in build, and as every well, the it's still day one, right? Like there's always a lot of improvements to do every day, but
absolutely
I think like there's definitely a good starting point for people.
cool. Yeah. Well, hopefully. Yeah, hopefully somebody learned something. And yeah, I'm not going to sit here and say that anything we're doing is the best way, but it's what we're doing, and every day trying to do it a little better.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. This was a pleasure, and
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
we appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Okay.